Alright, g'day IB psychologists. In this video, I want to help you understand how to write a contrast essay. Now, this is one of the 4 command terms that might be asked for an essay question. We have discuss, evaluate, to what extent. Those 3, I firmly believe, because I've written hundreds of essays, can all be answered using a very similar structure. The exception is the contrast essay. This is quite unique and it's quite different to those 3. So let's look at how you can write a contrast essay. We're going to look at 3 parts in this video. First, we'll look at what type of exam questions can actually ask you to contrast things, how do you answer the question, and we'll go through an example essay that I've written that uses this contrast command term. So first of all, what contrast exam questions can be asked? Well, any topic that uses a plural. So if in the guide, right, the IB psychology guide we can see here in the image, if it says something like study 1 neurotransmitter, well, you're never going to ask to contrast the effect of 2 neurotransmitters because the guide says 1, right? So research methods, you might be asked an essay question on contrasting the use of 2 research methods because there have been exam questions that have asked about 2 specific methods. In paper 2, they use the plural for explanations, and you might be asked about biological, cognitive, or social-cultural explanations of something. For example, in abnormal psychology, you could be asked about biological or cognitive explanations of a disorder. That also means then it makes sense they could ask you to contrast 2 explanations for one psychological disorder. Similar goes with etiologies. The other one I can think of is models of memory. You might be asked to contrast 2 models of memory. These are all that I can think of so far. If you've got another topic you're not sure of, if they could ask a plural or not, if you're not sure if you need to study 2 things or if it's just one, please leave a comment and me or someone in the community can help you out. Okay, so yeah, any topic that says 1 should never be a contrast question. Now, I will hasten to add, to my knowledge, since 2019, so in the last 3 years of exam seasons, there's been 1 contrast question. So it's not that common. All right, now here's some exam prep advice based on that, right? So if we work backwards, we know what the exam questions could be. Now we know how to prepare for them. The first step, before you worry about the discuss, evaluate, to what extent contrast command terms, right? Make sure you can define the key term in the topic. You can explain the topic, right? Give a detailed explanation, what, how, and why. And you can support that with a study. For example, research methods. You can define the research method. You can explain what it is, how it's used, and why it's used, and you can use a study or maybe 2 studies for an essay to support that. Now do the same thing for a second method, because you might be asked about 2. So you just put those 2 together, right? One's experiments, one's correlational studies. Make sure you can do that both. So if you're asked to discuss or evaluate 2 methods, you're prepared. And then I would, if you've got the time, right, once you've gone through all your exam prep, then I would try to think carefully about the contrasting points you might make. But I wouldn't begin revising for the exam by thinking about, okay, what's the contrasting points of these things? Because you can't contrast something if you don't know what they are first. So actually the planning and understanding the content first will help you. Now, that brings me to my next point. How do you answer a contrast question? Well, there are 2 schools of thought on this. I would say most people that haven't spent the time to write the example essays would probably say that you should contrast throughout, and they possibly come to this understanding by looking at the definition in the IB Psychology Guide, which says the definition of contrast is to give an account of the differences between 2 or more items or situations, referring to both, all of them throughout. Or you might want to contrast at the end. So you explain thing A, then explain thing B, and at the end you compare the 2. Now, what do I think is the best? Well, okay, I'm going to cop out here and say do what works for you. In the planning, you've got 5 minutes reading time in your exam. If a contrast question's there and you know you're going to answer it, spend some time thinking through what's the logical structure for that particular question. Generally speaking, I find it easier when I've written contrast essays, I find it easier to contrast the points at the end. And I think about this as an example. I find it difficult to really highlight and draw attention to 2 different things until I've first explained what they are. Now, if I just think, okay, and you can walk through this thought experiment for yourself. Try to contrast 2 things you know. Okay, I'm going to contrast two places that I know really well, right? The town I was born in, and then the town I live now. Okay, highlight the differences. Okay, well, they've got two different groups of people living in them. One's primarily Japanese, one's New Zealand. One's very densely populated, the other one's not so densely populated. I would say the occupations in this one tend to be more, of course, in working in offices. This one's more rural. But now, as a reader, does this make any sense to you? Now, what if I told you this, right? The town I'm from is a small town of about 20,000 people in rural New Zealand, and I'm now currently living in Yokohama, Japan, right? Now, suddenly, Yokohama, Japan is a population of about 3 million people. By giving you a little bit of a description of the two things first, my contrasting points will suddenly make that much more sense, and it's just easier to comprehend. Now, that's not that much of an abstract example. If we think about contrasting, say, two models of memory, well, there's so much to explain about both of them. I don't know how we would contrast all the way throughout an essay. Now, I'm going to write a contrasting two models of memory essay shortly, so I might have to come back to you and report again to see how I go, but I can't see how I would be mentioning the differences throughout. That being said, all right, let's look at the essay rubric. That being said, I'm about to show you an example essay that kind of does a bit of both. But if we just look at the rubric, now the contrast points you're going to make are where you're going to score points in your critical thinking. And okay, so I would also argue that it's less relevant where the contrast points happen, and it's more important the quality. How detailed are your explanations, and how accurate and relevant are your explanations of those contrasting points you're making? All right, and because you're going to be assessed on your critical thinking. The knowledge and understanding, I would argue, comes from your explanations of the things that you are contrasting. Let's stick with the research methods if it's about contrast the use of two methods. Well, your knowledge and understanding is explaining what those methods are, how and why they're used in the particular field of the question, like biological psychology or abnormal psychology, whatever the topic in the question is, right? Now, you've still got to show your studies as well. Okay, that's your use of research criterion C. And so it's pretty tricky to be contrasting throughout as well as talking about the studies. And so if we look at this framework, it kind of makes sense to me. You go, all right, here's thing A, and here's the study that demonstrates it, right? And then you might want to introduce a contrast point if it's relevant, or you go, here's thing B, here's the study, and now I'm going to show you all the ways in which they are different. All right, so let's have a look at an example and see what this might look like. So this is an example essay contrasting two techniques used to study the brain. Now, this is included in the post-traumatic stress disorder teacher support pack link in the description. But now, this would not be an exam question because you only have to study one technique, which is exactly why I'm using it as an example. I don't like using examples that students can try to memorize and copy because, well, that's just not the name of the game. Now, a good introduction, I think, will state the specific things you're going to contrast and then introduce the contrasting points you're going to make and then talk about the studies. In this case, it's saying I'm going to contrast the two techniques of MRI, fMRI. They differ mainly by what they measure, and there are two studies that I'm going to use to highlight this, okay? Firstly, now I begin by getting into explaining thing A, MRI. This is what it is. I've mentioned my contrasting point here, so now I'm going to explain this is what it is, how and why it's used. All right? I can write a techniques essay just like a research methods essay. Then I get into the study here about what MRIs show. Okay, and then the conclusion showing this is the value of an MRI. Okay, we can use them to show changes in the structure of the brain during meditation. Now I can say similar paradigms being used with fMRI, except we look at structure, brain activity with fMRI, not structure. And then I'm going to look at Deboard et al. This is same idea, mindfulness practice, and then we do before and after tests with the fMRI, and we find that brain activity changes as a result of mindfulness practice. Okay, so you can see here what I've done. It's a little bit of combining the both, right? I've had to explain MRI first and then study, and then I've just introduced how they're different and then explain fMRI and the study. Now, I would argue here that I could probably include more detail about what, how, and why fMRI is used. That would allow me to score higher marks. That's a limitation of this essay, I think. And then I get into the conclusion here, right? Here's my simple question, my simple answer saying this is the key difference between these two things. But notice how I've still had to explain two studies, and I've still had to explain what these things are and how they're used. Okay, now I get into more of the difference of another contrasting point. Okay, the idea of the duration of the changes in effect. So fMRIs can look at short-term effects on the brain, like we change brain chemistry and see what happens, or we change our biology and see what happens, whereas MRI, we're not looking at those short-term changes, it's looking at more long-term changes because the structure of the brain takes longer to actually change than the activity. Okay, and then I'm going to use a study here to demonstrate that. Now, this wouldn't score a perfect 22 out of 22. I would say this essay would score, I would hope, at least an 18, somewhere probably between a 17 and a 20 or 21, or maybe even a 22. It would depend on who's marking it. There's a fair bit of variability in the marking. But this just gives you an idea. I would probably also argue this gives you an idea that there's not just one way to answer these contrasting questions. It really depends on what works for you and the particular topic that you're writing about and the particular points you want to make. When I wrote this essay, it kind of made sense for me to go, okay, activity and structure, and then I can use the two studies because my two studies just happen to be on the exact same thing, mindfulness and meditation, right? You might not have that luxury in your essay. So the point of the story here is as long as you're explaining both topics using studies and making the contrasting points, then just plan carefully the most logical way you're going to convey that, and you'll do fine. Okay. All right, I hope that was helpful. Remember, we've got the blog, Facebook group, all the other stuff you can subscribe to. If you've got request videos, please leave a comment. But that was just a quick one, and when I write the models of memory contrasting essay, I might come back and let you know how I went on. All right, thanks.